Under the desert at Saqqara, one small burial chamber preserves some of the oldest religious writing ever discovered. The pyramid belongs to last ruler of Egypt's Fifth Dynasty. From the outside, it looks like a collapsed mound of stone. Inside, narrow passages descend to a dark room built for the dead king's body, where hieroglyphs cover the walls from floor to ceiling. For more than 4,000 years, these words stayed sealed in darkness. No priest recited them, no scribe copied them, and no living reader entered to explain what they meant. When archaeologists opened the chamber, they found instructions for the afterlife, spells to protect feed him, and lift him into the sky. Then, one passage turns violent. It says the dead king hunts the gods, cuts them open, cooks their bodies, and eats their power. That passage survives because Unas made a choice no earlier Egyptian king is known to have made. Unas ruled at the end of Egypt's Fifth Dynasty and died around 2345 before the Common Era. By the standards of Egypt's most famous monuments, his pyramid is not impressive. Its outer casing is gone, its sharp geometry has collapsed, and from a distance, it can look more like a natural hill than a royal tomb. The inside tells a different story. Behind the damaged exterior, the burial chambers preserve columns of carved hieroglyphs in a way the desert surface did not. The walls were not decorated only with images of offerings or royal power. They were covered with spoken formulas, ritual commands, and afterlife instructions meant to function for the king after death. This is why the Pyramid of Unas matters. It is the first known Egyptian pyramid where funerary texts were carved directly into the inner rooms. Later kings copied and expanded this tradition, and modern scholars call the whole collection the Pyramid Texts. These texts were not a book in the modern sense. They were arranged across stone walls, surrounding the dead king with words that were meant to be active. The writing told him how to pass guarded gates, how to rise among the stars, how to receive food, and how to become more than human. That makes Unas's ruined pyramid one of the most important religious sites ever found. Its exterior belongs to a broken monument. Its interior preserves the earliest large body of Egyptian sacred writing we can still read. The Pyramid Texts were carved centuries before many later famous scriptures took written form. They do not give us the beginning of religion itself, because human ritual is far older than writing, but they bring us closer than almost anything else to the beginning of recorded religion, when sacred power was first fixed permanently into signs on stone. For the Egyptians who carved these words, death was not a simple departure from the world. The king's body lay in a burial chamber, but his future depended on movement. He had to wake, breathe, stand, leave the tomb, cross the sky, and reach a place among divine beings who were not automatically waiting to welcome him. The Pyramid Texts were built for that dangerous passage. Some lines commanded doors to open, others named gods, identified guardians, rejected enemies, and gave the king the right phrases to speak at the right moments. In a world where divine names had power, knowing what to say was not symbolic, it was survival. The dead king was not imagined as an ordinary ghost. The goal was transformation. He needed to become an Akh, a transfigured spirit, effective and radiant, able to live with the gods and move through the cosmic order. The texts supplied the ritual knowledge that made that change possible. That is why their location matters. These were not hymns sung by crowds in a temple courtyard. They were not teachings for common worshippers. They were sealed inside the pyramid, surrounding the royal corpse in chambers that were meant to remain closed forever. Their audience was the dead king, the gods, and whatever forces stood between them. The writing worked like a sacred machine. Priests had spoken funerary rites during burial, but stone could keep speaking after the priests left. Every carved sign preserved a command, a protection, or a claim to divine status. The walls became a permanent voice inside the tomb. This makes the Pyramid Texts very different from a story told for comfort. They are practical religious technology. They assume the afterlife has obstacles, hunger, violence, gatekeepers, ferrymen, ladders, storms, and rival powers. The king must be equipped to overcome all of them. And if words could open the sky, feed the dead, and turn a corpse into a god, then the strongest words would not necessarily be gentle ones. In this world, the most dangerous utterances could also be the most effective. That is the world in which the Cannibal Hymn appears. To understand why a carved sentence could matter after death, we have to enter an Egyptian idea called Heka. Heka is often translated as magic, but that word can be misleading. To the Egyptians, Heka was not stage illusion or superstition. It was a real force woven into the structure of the cosmos. Gods used it, kings used it, priests used it. Creation itself could be imagined as an act of divine speech, where naming and commanding helped bring order into being. That belief changed what language was. A spoken formula did not merely express hope, it performed an action. A written sign did not merely represent a sound, it preserved power in visible form. If the right words were spoken by the right person, in the right ritual setting, they could protect a body, repel an enemy, summon food, open a gate, or identify the dead king with a god. Even the appearance of the pyramid texts carried meaning. In some pyramids, the carved hieroglyphs were filled with blue-green pigment. That color was not decorative in a modern sense. It evoked vegetation, fresh growth, the life-giving Nile, and rebirth. The writing itself was made to look alive, as if the signs on the wall were active participants in the king's transformation. This is why the Cannibal Hymn cannot be treated as a strange poem added for shock value. It belonged to a world where ritual language was expected to do something. When the text says the king hunts gods, slaughters them, cooks them, and consumes their power, it is not casual imagery. It is a verbal act placed inside a royal tomb for a purpose. The words were meant to work. Then, in the Pyramid of Unas, the tone changes. The passage modern scholars call the Cannibal Hymn is found in Pyramid Texts Utterances 273 and 274. It is one of the most disturbing sections in the entire corpus because the dead king no longer sounds like a soul asking to be admitted into the afterlife. He appears as a force entering the heavens with violence. Unas is described as a hunter on a cosmic scale. The gods are not distant judges seated safely above him. They become prey. The text gives the king helpers who seize divine beings for him, bind them, and prepare them. The afterlife is no longer pictured as a peaceful journey through gates and offerings. It becomes a royal hunt in the sky. The world reacts before the violence is even complete. The sky trembles, the earth shakes, the stars grow dark. The powers of heaven recognize that something dangerous has arrived among them. Unas is not approaching the gods as an equal guest. He is rising as a predator whose presence throws the cosmic order into panic. One of the most striking images calls him a bull of the heavens. In Egyptian thought, the bull was a symbol of strength, fertility, and royal power. Here, that strength becomes terrifying. Unas is not weak, preserved, or dependent. He is overwhelming. He is the dead king transformed into a being whose hunger reaches the divine world itself. That is the dramatic shift in Utterances 273 and 274. The tomb wall no longer speaks only of protection, ascent, and rebirth. It speaks of pursuit, capture, and domination. The king has entered the sky. The gods are afraid, and the hymn is moving toward the moment that made this passage infamous. The hunt is over. The divine prey has been taken, and now the text prepares to say what Unas does to the gods. The next lines turn the hunt into a ritual slaughter. The hymn gives Unas servants in the sky. Divine assistants seize the gods, drag them toward him, and make them ready for the royal meal. One figure captures them, another binds them, another cuts them open. The gods are handled like sacrificial animals, moved through a sequence of capture, restraint, killing, and preparation. The text even names the cosmic butcher. Khonsu, a god later known especially as a moon god, is described as killing the gods for Unas and taking out what is inside them. Then another divine figure prepares them for cooking. The heavens become a slaughterhouse, and the dead king is the one for whom the entire operation is performed. The imagery grows more shocking when the hymn brings in cauldrons. The gods are not only defeated, they are boiled. They are cooked in great vessels as food for the king. The sky itself becomes a ritual kitchen, with divine bodies reduced to a feast. This is not a vague metaphor of victory. The language follows the practical steps of making a meal. The hymn organizes that meal by rank. The great gods, the senior powers of heaven, are assigned to one meal. Lesser gods are assigned to others. The old gods can even become fuel for the cooking fire. Every level of the divine world is drawn into the same system of consumption. The highest beings, the smaller beings, the ancient beings, all become part of what sustains Unas. That structure matters. The hymn is not saying Unas defeats one enemy god. It imagines total absorption. The king consumes the divine hierarchy from top to bottom. Nothing in heaven is placed beyond his reach because every category of god is converted into food, fuel, or power. Then, the text explains why the eating matters. Unas does not eat only flesh. He eats what makes the gods divine. He swallows their magic. He takes in their spirits. He absorbs their souls, their knowledge, their strength, and their authority. Their power does not remain outside him after death. It passes into him through the meal. In the world of the hymn, eating is transformation. To consume the god gods is to become greater than the gods. Unas feeds on their bodies, but the real prize is their essence. The divine order is broken down, cooked, and taken into the king until his afterlife is imagined not as survival, but as domination. To modern ears, this sounds like sacrilege. Religion is supposed to preserve distance between humans and gods. Worshippers kneel, offer, praise, and ask. They do not chase the divine across the sky, butcher it, boil it, and swallow it. But the hymn comes from a world where eating was not only nutrition, it was a transfer. Food entered the body and became flesh, blood, heat, and strength. If a person ate grain, the grain became part of the person. If a king ate sacred power, that power became part of the king. This logic appears in many ancient ritual systems. A sacrificial animal was not just killed, it moved value between worlds. Offerings fed gods, ancestors, and spirits. In some rituals, eating from a sacred meal joined the participant to the being honored by that meal. The boundary between body and power was not fixed in the way modern people often imagine it. The Cannibal Hymn pushes that logic to its extreme. If divine beings possess magic, authority, perception, and eternal life, then consuming them is a method of acquisition. The meal is a spell with a physical image. The king takes what the gods are by taking them into himself. That makes the brutality more coherent, not less disturbing. The hymn is not a random fantasy of violence. It is a royal afterlife formula built on a terrifying premise. The dead king must not depend on the gods for status. He must become a power the gods cannot resist. This is why the hymn feels so alien. It does not imagine heaven as a peaceful court where the king receives a seat. It imagines heaven as a contested field of force. Divinity is not only honored, it can be captured. Immortality is not only granted, it can be seized. The sacred is not untouchable, it is edible. For Unas, the afterlife is not admission into the divine order. It is the overthrow of that order. By incorporation, he becomes greater because less remains outside him. And that is the darkest logic of the hymn. If divine power can be eaten, then supremacy belongs to the being who has consumed the most. But the strangest thing about these words is not only what they say, it is where they were placed. The Cannibal Hymn was not carved on a temple wall for crowds to see. It was not recited in a public festival or taught to ordinary worshippers as doctrine. It was cut into the hidden rooms of a pyramid inside the burial complex of a dead king. Its first audience was not a congregation. It was Unas himself. Once the funeral was finished, the pyramid was sealed. The corridors were blocked. The burial chamber was meant to become unreachable, a closed stone world containing the king, his equipment, his offerings, and his spells. The texts were not preserved for readers. They were installed like machinery. That is what makes the pyramid texts so different from later religious books. They were not books in the modern sense. They were ritual instructions fused to architecture. Every carved line had a job: protect the royal body, guide the soul, open gates, command gods, and force the dead king upward into the sky. The tomb was a private engine of resurrection. Its walls held passwords for the afterlife, names of divine beings, threats against enemies, and formulas for transformation. Sacred knowledge was locked beside one corpse because its purpose was not education. Its purpose was action. This also changes how we should hear the violence of the Cannibal Hymn. It was not meant to shock human listeners in a temple courtyard. It was a weapon placed in darkness, prepared for the moment when the king crossed from death into cosmic power. For thousands of years, no living person read it. Sand, stone, and royal secrecy kept the words out of sight. The hymn waited in a chamber built to stay closed forever. Then, in the late 19th century, explorers entered the Pyramid of Unas and found the oldest large body of religious writing ever recovered from ancient Egypt. The audience of one had been interrupted. By the time modern excavators reached Unas, the pyramid was no longer the clean monument built for a king. Its outer casing had been stripped away. Its passages had suffered damage. Sand and broken stone covered the site at Saqqara, and the name of the man buried inside had been silent for millennia. In 1881, the French Egyptologist Gaston Maspero entered the pyramid's underground chambers. What he found changed the study of ancient Egypt. The walls were not blank. They were covered with columns of hieroglyphs, carved in careful lines across the burial chamber, antechamber, and corridors. At first, this was not a famous religious book with a known title. It was a buried archive with no cover, no author, and no table of contents. Maspero and later scholars had to copy, compare, translate, and organize the inscriptions from Unas and other Old Kingdom pyramids before their scale became clear. The texts were far older than the coffin texts painted inside Middle Kingdom coffins. and far older than the Book of the Dead copied on papyrus in the New Kingdom. They belonged to the Old Kingdom more than 4,000 years in the past. Gradually, scholars recognized them as the oldest known large corpus of Egyptian religious and funerary writing. That discovery turned a ruined pyramid into one of the most important religious archives on Earth. It revealed that Egyptian ideas about the afterlife, divine speech, cosmic ascent, and royal transformation were already highly developed at an astonishingly early date. But one passage stood apart from the rest. The Cannibal Hymn was too violent, too royal, and too extreme to blend smoothly into later tradition. Similar spells could be adapted, expanded, and reused, but this vision of a king hunting, butchering, and consuming the gods did not become a normal feature of later royal tombs. The chamber had been reopened. The words had returned. The mystery was why the most savage of them had been left behind. The strange thing about the Cannibal Hymn is not only that it survived, it is that it did not spread. After Unas, pyramid texts continued to appear in royal tombs. Later kings had their chambers filled with spells for resurrection, protection, ascent to the sky, and union with the gods. Some passages were copied again and again. Others were rearranged or adapted. Egyptian scribes treated sacred language as something powerful, useful, and worth preserving. But the Cannibal Hymn remained limited. It appears in the Pyramid of Unas and in a small number of early related traditions, yet it never became a standard feature of later pyramid inscriptions. The image of the dead king feeding on divine bodies did not become part of the normal script of royal eternity. That absence matters. Egyptian religion was not static, but it was deeply conservative. Priests and scribes often preserved old formulas long after their original meaning had changed. If a spell was considered effective, it could survive for centuries. So when a passage this dramatic fades from use, it raises a difficult question. Why? One possibility is that the hymn was already archaic when it was carved. It may have belonged to an older layer of royal religion, one that reached back before the pyramid walls recorded it. The scribes of Unas may not have invented it. They may have inherited it. Later Egyptians may have found its language too dangerous, too strange, or too inappropriate for continued use. A king who joins the gods is one thing. A king who slaughters them, cooks them, and absorbs their power is something far more unsettling. Even in a religious world filled with transformation and divine violence, this was extreme. That makes the hymn more than a shocking curiosity. It may be a fragment of a spiritual world that was already disappearing when history first caught sight of it. The walls of Unas's pyramid do not give us the beginning of that belief. They give us one of its last visible traces. Behind the carved signs is the suggestion of older ceremonies, older myths, and older fears that were not fully carried forward. After the Old Kingdom, the spells did not disappear with the pyramids. They moved. By the Middle Kingdom, many of the old royal formulas were being copied onto wooden coffins. These are now called the Coffin Texts. They still promised resurrection, protection, and travel through the dangerous regions of the afterlife, but the audience had changed. The dead person was no longer always a king. He could be a governor, a priest, a wealthy official, or a woman from an elite household. This was not equality in the modern sense. Most Egyptians could not afford decorated coffins, tomb equipment, or professional scribes, but eternity was no longer sealed inside the king's pyramid. Sacred language had begun to circulate among powerful non-royal families, and with it came access to spells that once belonged to the crown. Centuries later, this tradition expanded again into what we call the Book of the Dead. The Egyptians knew it as spells for going forth by day. Instead of being carved permanently into stone walls, many of these spells were written on papyrus scrolls and placed in tombs. They could include illustrations, names, blanks filled in for the owner, and famous scenes like the weighing of the heart before Osiris. The Book of the Dead was not a single fixed book. It was a collection of selected spells, copied and arranged for people who had enough wealth to prepare for burial properly. Its purpose was practical: help the dead pass gates, answer divine beings, avoid destruction, and emerge into a renewed existence. That long development makes Unas's chamber look even more unusual. Later funerary texts offered guidance, passwords, and protection to a widening circle of the dead. Unas's text described a king taking divine power by force. The famous Egyptian afterlife tradition did not begin as a peaceful papyrus in a noble's tomb. Its oldest written layer was carved in darkness beneath a pyramid, where eternity still belonged to one ruler, and even the gods were not safe. That is where the trail ends, back in the small, dark chamber beneath Saqqara, where blue-green hieroglyphs cut across the stone. In those words, Unas does not simply hope to live again. He rises armed with magic, hunts the gods, gods, eats their power, and enters eternity as one of them. The oldest sacred writing we have is not a gentle prayer. It is a spell of conquest, preserved in darkness. Thank you for watching. If this story changed how you imagine ancient religion, write your thoughts in the comments, and keep exploring the first myths humanity left behind.